I'm Ben Ryman, and this is Behaviour Speak.
So she'd been institutionalized for many, many years. And so just to focus on one issue, a critical consequence for her was as simple as getting access to diet soda. She loved it. But the support team and the previous practitioner had decided that because she would sometimes access soda by engaging in severe self-injurious behaviour, that they would put that under extension. And so then what happened following was a massive escalation in that self-injurious behaviour, to the point where she was hitting her head, slamming her head as hard as she could onto concrete floors. And you could imagine the response from staff in that situation, right? They could ignore it up to a certain point where they felt like, okay, if I don't do something now, she's going to severely injure herself. So that would be intermittently reinforced, right? And so, like, the simple solution was, again, kind of in a kind of more simple form, looking at alternative sets and understanding that, one, there is no evidence that this is affecting her health in a negative way. But more than that, it's a basic human right. Like Oliver knows, my favourite drink is Pepsi Max. We call it black champagne over here. But right, like if I'm afforded that basic human right to drink a box, 30 can box of Pepsi Max in a week, why is she restricted from that? So the intervention was really just getting people to realise how important that was to her and how self-injurious behaviour had become the only viable option for her to access that. So it was allowing her and giving her other ways to access that, but removing the infringement on her basic human right. And so that shift was the hardest part of the intervention, right? Convincing people within that setting and trying to draw back to my own choices as an adult, some of the choices that they made. But the barrier was the perceptions amongst the group about how this would be viewed by others, right? And whether they would be enacting their duty of care. So often it's a cultural shift too, right? Where you have to go in and you have to, with humility, you've got to work with people to slightly shift their views from that pathological orientation to the self-injury tucked away almost immediately.
Today I'm joined by Oliver Roschke and John Wooderson for one of the most paradigm-shifting conversations I've had on Behaviour Speak. We dig into the constructional approach and what it means for positive behaviour support, especially in systems that have become increasingly focused on compliance, restrictive practices, and behaviour reduction. This episode really asks us to reflect on whether our supports are truly person-centered, or whether we've drifted into serving systems over people. Oliver and John share powerful case examples that challenge the way many of us were trained to think about so-called challenging behavior. And they offer a practical framework for shifting towards quality of life, choice, and meaningful outcomes. If you work in PBS, behavior analysis, disability services, or mental health, this is one you're going to want to sit with. What happens when behavior support stops focusing on reducing problem behavior and starts building the life a person actually wants? Let's get into it. Oliver, John, welcome to Behaviour Speak.
Thank you very much, Ben. Excited to be here. Thanks for having us, Ben.
I'm stoked. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge I am producing this podcast in the territories of the Klamath, Klehus, Homoko, Comox, and Sechelt First Nations. As always, grateful to be here. Oliver, John, let's start a bit with your journeys, kind of how you came into behavior analysis. I know you both came through very different routes, and maybe kind of finish with kind of what pulled you towards the constructional approach specifically.
Sure. Well, again, thanks very much for inviting us, Ben. So I guess I'll start with I'm a board-certified behaviour analyst, and I've probably worked in the human services field for a little over 30 years. So I've been around the traps. I actually began my career as a primary school teacher. Do you call that primary in Canada? Yep. Okay, nice. Which I absolutely love, to be honest. I've still got very fond memories of dressing up in pirate outfits, playing my guitar, and spending my days shaping the young minds that I was working with. Looking back, though, I guess I do have a regret in that I wasn't actually exposed to behaviour analysis during my teacher training or during the 10 years that I was a teacher. Then about 20 years ago, I moved into disability services, eventually into behaviour support after I was seconded to the at that time the newly established Queensland Centre for Excellence in Behaviour Support. And it was there that I was introduced to behaviour analysis. I actually had a mentor, my supervisor was a BCBA from the States, and he started feeding me seminal works by Israel Goldiamond, Tom Gilbert, and others. I was just absolutely hooked from that point on. I later completed my certification, and probably over the last 5 to 10 years, I've been working in organizations in director roles, particularly focused on performance improvement, helping practitioners work and be as successful as they can. And before recently starting this company with my friend and colleague, Oliver, called Constructional Solutions. In terms of what drew me to the constructional approach, I guess I've kind of fallen into what Goldiamond describes as the pathological approach, right? When I started my career, the focus on reduction and elimination of behavior. And what I learned over the many years is, through trial and error, I guess, that, that only gets you so far. But the constructional approach provides this pragmatic orientation toward coming back around from the beginning to what matters most. And that's working towards the desired lifestyle outcomes of the participants that we work with. Very powerful technology for that.
Yeah. So probably also a bit of a detour into behavior analysis. So I'm originally German, and when I graduated from high school, at that time in Germany, you had to decide whether you join a military service or whether you do a voluntary kind of social work practicum. And so I opted for the social work practicum option, which took me to Scotland, where I was, the first time I worked kind of in an out-of-home care setting and with kids with disabilities. And I just, immensely kind of enjoyed that work. And that led me to pursue a master's or like a bachelor in special education first. But there was no exposure to kind of behavior analysis or, just making sense of, how to teach, how to rearrange teaching environments. And so I just stumbled kind of, after my degree across different countries. I lived in Ireland for a while, looking for sunshine, didn't find it, moved to Korea, did a bit of English teaching over there. And then when I moved to New Zealand, I was exposed to behavior analysis for the first time when I started at a special education setting where they hired me as a behavior support practitioner, even though I had no kind of formal training or kind of learning history really, working in that field. So, and at that time, I had a supervisor who was a BCBA and who also encouraged me to pursue a master's in behavior analysis. And he was a bit of a kind of anti-establishment type of person. So he introduced me to Goldiamond's ideas, and he, regularly challenged me, asking questions like, why are you teaching those kids those skills? Like, how are they going to benefit from those skills and from those expectations in the long term? And I think where that shift really crystallized for me was when we set up a vocational training program for. Can you hear that noise in the background? Sorry. Yeah. Okay, so we set up a vocational training program for young teenagers who are basically unable to access the mainstream curriculum. So they hadn't been to school for more than 2 years, and they really struggled with the classroom environment. So we looked at what learning environment can we design to allow those young people to learn, to be part of a group, and to learn some of those essential life skills. And it was just incredible to see, what those young people who were labeled with, pathological demand avoidance, with like being unable to learn, were able to achieve in a context that was really designed, right, to work with their strengths and with their interests. And I think that really got me kind of hooked in this way of thinking. What are the repertoires people need to be successful? What are the opportunities they need? And how can we align whatever we teach with their strengths and preferences? And, and that's been kind of my journey with positive behavior support ever since coming to Australia, meeting John, and then, also having the great fortune of, being able to take PhD electives with Joe Lang, Paul Andronis, and being able to, sit in the NCA lab at Endicott has just been incredible. Just like really inspiring and, just wanting to learn more and to do better.
Really cool. Do you have a certification with the International Behavior Analysis Organization, the Qualified Applied Behavior Analysis Credentialing Board, the Behavior Analyst Certification Board, or are certified through your region's Behavior Analyst Credentialing Board? You can earn continuing education units for this episode by going to www.behaviorspeak.com and clicking on CEUs. The first secret word is contract. Okay, we're going to kind of get into the constructional approach and kind of how it fits into the PBS framework, but we're also going to kind of dig into PBS in Australia. And I'm wondering if maybe that might be a good place to start, because a lot of the things you folks said that you really like about the constructional approach, from my perspective, is also PBS. And I actually, from talking to some of the other guests I've had on, I know there's some differences for sure. But from just sort of that explanation, the PBS that I know, so for folks that are listening, I'm in the Pacific Northwest, and so the sort of, and I'm learning more and more, there are multiple schools of thought when it comes to PBS. There's a UK PBS, there's an Australia PBS, there's a Lavinia Willis PBS, and there's a University of Oregon, University of Washington kind of PBS, and I'm learning there's a few in kind of the Midwest too that are that are kind of interesting as well. And now I'm learning, what is it about PBS in Australia that it needs a constructional approach brought in?
I might jump in here and just say that I think the power of the constructional approach is that it provides an orientation. Right. So you talk about PBS having many flavors, but like Baskin and Robbins or Ben and Jerry's, which part of the world that you're in. But you can implement any of those technologies, any of those systems in either a pathological or a constructional approach. And for us, I think that's what really helps us guide us in our practice towards better outcomes. It's using the constructional approach as an orientation. But I was wondering, before we get into the Australian context, if we might talk a little bit about how we see the emergence of positive behaviour support in the US and the kind of its intentions at that time and whether that really played out. So we're about to publish a paper on this, but we look back at the emergence of positive behaviour support in the 80s, I guess, in the US, and primarily as a response to aversive and coercive practices, right? That were pretty common through behavior modification. And what we saw too was that it developed at around about the same time as there was changes in societal expectations about what was acceptable, right? Whether the use of punishment procedures was appropriate for people with disability, and particularly people who were the most vulnerable people in society, right? So we saw that these changes were also occurring alongside the momentum behind the deinstitutionalization and normalization movements. So I guess about a decade later, we saw the same kind of shifts within the Australian context too, when those movements became more prominent within our area. But the shift that we saw was the shift towards support that was more socially acceptable and more clearly tied to the person's quality of life. What I find interesting about Goldiamond's work, though, is that it precedes all of that. He actually laid the conceptual groundwork for this shift in the 70s, 60s. If you look back to his 74 paper, that seminal 100-plus page article toward a constructional approach to social problems, he was arguing for a constructional approach focused on the establishment, transfer, or reinstatement of repertoires, but in a manner that constructs the conditions under which a better life becomes possible. And I think that really aligns with the original intention of positive behavior support that within our context, I think has been lost a little bit because of the orientation. So at that time, we saw PBS as a rights-based approach aimed at improving quality of life, improving meaningful skill development, people's autonomy and participation in the community. Reducing challenging behavior was really a secondary goal or aim. If you look at the work of Ted Carr, for example, who's a real hero of mine as well, tragically lost early in life to the field. But his 2002 paper made the claim that reductions in behavior are insufficient as an outcome if it doesn't result in subsequent improvements in quality of life. So also, if we look at the evidence base for quality of life over the past 40 to 50 years, there's a strong case that positive behavior support is very effective at reducing challenging behavior. But then the subsequent improvements in quality of life, the evidence for that is much more inconsistent and limited at best. So then within the Australian context, we start to see this conflict or this tension, as we like to describe it, where, and Goldiamond talked about this really well, that if the problem that's being treated is behavior, once you start to see that as the problem, then practice inevitably drifts towards reduction and elimination, a pathological approach, which we can kind of unpack a little bit further later on. But what he was saying to us all those many, many years ago is the alternative is to look away from the challenge of behavior and instead focus on building meaningful lives for the people that we work with.
Yeah, I'm really glad you kind of went back and said that, because, I think I was kind of, I'll try to humble myself a bit here, because I think I was sort of standing on this pedestal of being in the Pacific Northwest, not far from Ted Carr. My supervisor is Joe Lucician, student of Ted's and Rob Horner's. I think Joe still holds a lot of those concepts in play. But when I think about sort of the last 10 or 15 years of my work and the work of the agencies that I've worked in, it still has had, we quote, I think, a lot of things. We refer to the evolution of the science paper by Carr quite a bit. It still says right on the front of our behavior plans, behaviors to be reduced. Target behaviors to be reduced is still written in there. Yeah, we talk about replacement behaviors. We talk about all those sorts of pieces. And so, because I have heard, not on the podcast, but sort of in conversations with other folks, some who, one colleague in particular who is, they disagree with the constructional approach, but I think what they said to me was, "There's nothing new here," and it's true. I mean, you're identifying that as well. But it also brings back the point that PBS was maybe originally intended to be constructional, and that got lost quickly, I think, not just in Australia, but I think over here as well.
I can't help but think that, Rob Horner, Ted Carr had to be influenced by Goldiamond's work, right? Even if it wasn't directly cited. He was president of ARBA, right? At that time when all of this, prior to all of this was emerging. He was a seminal figure in the field.
Absolutely.
Yes, yeah. And ethics was so prevalent, right, at that time. You have the Behrman report, right? And a lot of Goldiamond's writing was really on the ethics of behavior change, right? And there was certainly like a pretty vibrant debate at that point in time. Yeah. But it's interesting what you're saying, Ben, with the drift of PBS, right, towards really kind of behavior management and behavior reduction, because that's really what we see in the Australian context explicitly. Yeah. So what's very interesting for us in Australia is that, PBS is really, people get positive behavior support or access to behavior support contingent on risk behaviors, right? Behavioral issues or the use unregulated restrictive practices, right? And what happened over here is that now PBS is really tied to like a regulatory framework, right? For the use of regulated restrictive practices. And if you go back to what John talked about, its roots, improving quality of life outcomes, it really changes, right? Its purpose and its function under those circumstances, because we're saying first, your life needs to deteriorate. Your options need to be restricted before you can access an intervention or supports that are actually designed to improve your quality of life. And also what we find in the research in the PBS literature, as John has hinted to already, there is reliable demonstration of behavior reduction, but we do not necessarily see that there's a link between risk behaviors going down and quality of life improving, or even risk behaviors going down and people having an improved quality of life. When we did our literature review, we found very, very little evidence, and we can, share some of those papers, that some of those common assumptions that we hold, right, or those behaviors lead to a deterioration in quality of life. If you take them away from the person, their life will be better, right? Their life will be less restricted. Our literature doesn't really back up that assumption, right? And again, that's where we see a refocus towards a construction orientation to be so critical, right? Because we should ask the person first, what do they want their life to look like, right? What is a better life for you on your terms? And then we can design interventions that help you get there, right? And that's really this shift at the moment, just what you said, right? behavior support plans at the moment, often in our context, and it sounds like similar to yours, they catalog risk behaviors, right? They catalog restrictive practices, and then they're used as evidence documents to justify the use of practices that potentially, breach human rights law, right? So you can really see how we've completely drifted away from the original intention of PBS.
Yeah, and I also think, and I was thinking as you were saying that, I know for me and some of my training, and if we go back to some of the early PBS, and it was sort of that, I forget the name of the book. It was sort of non-aversive approaches to alternatives to punishment, I think was the book. Non-aversive alternatives to punishment.
Lavinia.
Yeah. And I know what's been emphasized in all the companies that I've worked all the way through that use PBS is that by no means do we ever use punishment procedures. And that has sort of been the sort of difference between sort of so-called traditional ABA and us, is that we avoid the use of punishment procedures. And I think still to this day, we try to do that, but instead I think those punishment procedures have been replaced by those restricted practices.
Yes. Yes, right. And we're still coercive and restrictive if we do not give the person alternatives, right? If we don't shape out new repertoires and new opportunities, right, under those circumstances. Absolutely, yes.
Just to add to that, I think within our Australian context, and I don't know if it's the same where you are, Ben, but and colleagues of ours have written about this quite extensively, particularly Dr. Brent Hayward, talked about the conflation of positive behaviour support with restrictive practices. So what was initially intended as a safeguard within our system, right, the development of positive behaviour support to move away from that, has really, honestly become both the mechanism through which restriction is justified as well as the potential cure. So you've got this real tension.
Yeah. And the national data show it doesn't work, right? So our Quality and Safeguards Commission, they publish quarterly reports on the frequency of use of restrictive practices, and the data for years, it's increasing or stable, right? So it really raises that question, are we addressing this issue, right, effectively? And are we doing people justice, right, who we're supposed to serve and whose lives are supposed to be improved through our support and intervention?
Well, then it also kind of begs the question, is PBS now meant to improve the quality of life of these clients, these individuals with disabilities, or the people supporting them?
Exactly, right? Are we serving the system, right? Or are we serving the participant? And how do we pivot towards, right, serving the participant again, which goes back to the initial intention of PBS. And I think that's where we really see the ideas that Goldiamond articulated, right? That constructional orientation to be a really, really powerful, right, approach for us to take. And I mean, we could talk a bit about, how are we integrating that into our practice? How are we shaping our organization to be more constructional? And how are we applying those ideas to supervision, to working with organizations, right? Because we're not saying that safety is not an important outcome, right? But for the people we work with, often safety is the outcome that is more desired by other stakeholders, right? By their family, by the service provider. What those people really want in life, are very, very different, right? Critical consequences. And it's because they are so restricted, it's those risk behaviors almost seem necessary, right, for them in those situations.
So if I were to walk into a PBS service using a constructional approach, what would I see that's different?
Yeah, I can get started, John, and if you want to add to that. So I think it starts, with the intake, right? We want to know why the person is there and what their desired outcomes are, right? So our service, we don't start with cataloging behavioral challenges, deficits, problems. The initial part of our intake process, our intake interview is really, we want to identify, assuming we're successful, what would the outcome be for you, right? What would you have that you currently don't have, right? How would your life improve as a result of our support, right? And we don't necessarily conduct any assessment before we know where the person wants to go. Because the challenge is, if we assess a way without really understanding where the person wants to go, how do we know, right? How do we know how to proceed? Like we have this, we talked about it the other day, John and I, just, like a somewhat hyperbolic example is, imagine you want to improve your fitness, right? And you hire a fitness coach, and your PBS fitness coach enters your life and they walk straight past you, right? They come into your house, they walk straight past you. They interview your parents first, right? They want to know what your parents think, everything that's wrong with you, what should be improved, right? Then they speak to your friends. And again, they ask the same question, right? What's wrong with this guy? How should their life improve? Then they go to your coworkers, ask them the same questions, right? And then they construct your fitness intervention plan that says things like, oh, this person should go to bed at this point in time, right? This person shouldn't meet with those friends because they have a really bad influence on them. They're never going to be fit when they continue hanging out with those friends. And they should really not be drinking so much on the weekend, right? So if that would happen to us, it's pretty simple, right? We would fire that person. We would kick them out of our lives, right? We have that level of control. But I think it is really like a metaphor for how a lot of positive behavior support, is currently delivered. It's without the person and upon the person. And the strategies that are being proposed don't really consider what the person values under those circumstances. And I think that's where we find it is so critical to really identify what are your valued outcomes, what are your reinforcers, what are the situations that you continue to approach, right, that are meaningful to you. And that might mean that, you need to spend more time with that person, right? You need to form a relationship, right? You need to observe them frequently across a range of environments before you even proceed with any other assessments or plan writing. So I think that is really like a critical feature we find is this really we want to get a sense of where is the person wanting to go before we make any changes in their life. And we apply a very similar approach to working with providers, but maybe that's something we can talk about a bit later, because something else we find in our practice, especially as it relates to restrictive practices, their staff behavior, right? So in those circumstances, we believe it's not the participant whose behavior needs to change, right? It is the staff whose behavior that needs to change. And we believe you need a distinct plan to be developed with the organization implementing those practices. And again, in order to do that, you need to identify what are their desired outcomes, right? So maybe I hand over to John. I mean, would maybe also be good just to talk through a case example, just to see, how does this service evolve, right, in practice?
Yeah, absolutely. So what Oliver is talking about there is something that we've directly taken from Goldiamond's work, right? Where he talks about the importance of a social contract. And he was really drawing on Rousseau's work, much earlier work, and he talks about the practitioner as a double agent often, right? So someone who is both serving the client and society at large. And there's this tension there. But he made the case, and this is what we try to do within our organization, that the contract is with the person who the behavior change will occur. So he argues that if he's contracting with the parents, then it's the parents' behavior that he's working on to change to produce particular outcomes that are important to them. So that might be a better relationship with their child, right? Or a smoother running household, for example. But if the parents are wanting their child's behavior to change, then that's really a different kind of contract, right? And so if he's contracting with the child, it's about what the child sees as important outcomes. That's a bit of a challenge within our system, right? Just presenting that idea as something that's repetitive to a lot of people is challenging. Articulating in a way that people buy into. But I think you can serve both of those interests if you approach it as separate social contracts. Certainly the families that I've been working with more recently are open to that idea when you present it in a particular way. To give a bit of a case example, so this was a few years back, but I was recruited to work with a very young girl, 6 years old, autism, very limited formal communication, and she was in her first year of school. We call it prep in Australia. But she missed almost entirely the whole year of school before I came on board. And what had happened was that apparently she'd been doing really well up until she experienced a really traumatic injury in the playground at recess. The teachers didn't really pick up on it because she didn't say anything. She wasn't crying. But then her mum picked her up in the afternoon, took one look at her and immediately knew something was wrong. So whisked her off to the doctor. The doctor prescribed it as the worst broken arm that he'd ever seen. It needed surgery and a rod in place. So she was off for a couple of months. And then when they tried to reintroduce her back to school, Mum brought her in through the school gate. She immediately started becoming distressed. She was crying, started to scratch herself. So what they told me was that then the principal came out and said, it was a small little country school, said, don't worry, leave her with us. She'll calm down after a while. She'll be fine. Don't worry. So they locked the gate. The mum went home. Mum got a call within an hour. By the time she got back to the school, she was just covered in blood, screaming, scratching, hurting herself for that full hour. So then by the time I was recruited, it was pretty clear that school was just absolutely impossible for her at that point. And that distress had generalized to all kinds of stimuli associated with school as well. So she had siblings. If they went to put on their school uniform, she would start becoming really distressed and hurting herself. Anyone mentioned the word school, similar result. Driving past school, anywhere near school, same kind of response. It had gotten to the point where she was refusing to leave the family, right? So in trying to understand her situation and develop this social contract with her, I need to spend time with her. Now, it might be, I'll try to get you to picture this, but I'm pretty big bloke, 6'4", Polynesian build, wide set shoulders, but I couldn't do anything. I couldn't understand her situation until I'd spent considerable time, a couple of weeks, playing within her backyard, dressing in tutus, playing with her dogs, jumping up and down on the trampoline, until she was in a position that I was, a signal for reinforcement and somebody that she could trust, right? We might call it rapport, for example. But then so I also spoke to the school, and what I found out was that, she was a model student. In that first week that she was at school. She was the first one on the floor, absolutely glued to the teacher. She had a bunch of friends in school. For all intents and purposes, she loved school. But then that injury happened, right? So I didn't, there weren't any papers at the time, and I hadn't read any of the work that was being done in the animal literature around constructional exposure training or therapy. But really thinking back on it, that's the approach that I took, right? It was moving through that graduated process of getting closer to school, into the classroom, engaging in lessons in a very controlled way when she always had the opt-out option. So she couldn't say much, but she volunteered, school's finished. It kind of surprised me. So anytime in any of the sessions that she says school's out, or she also had the option that, I kept an eye on her. Anytime she showed distress, we terminated the session. And it terminated her exposure, her proximity to that aversive stimulus. But crucially, what I didn't do was then stop the session completely. So we would go and do something fun together, whether it be jump on a trampoline or go to the park, or she loved egg sandwiches. We would go and get an egg sandwich from the local deli. But within 2 weeks, she moved pretty rapidly back into the classroom full time by taking this approach that valued and honored her assent and dissent. Reading the recent literature about that, it just really resonates for me because I know firsthand how powerful it can be. And the most rewarding thing was, after my involvement, at the end of the school, the teacher and the mum had called me up and said, she's doing fantastic. She's the best reader in the class. Right? All through the power of a well-planned social contract, where I got to know her, understood what was important to her, how she could communicate her assent and dissent, and then that we were moving towards goals that were important to her, and in a way that she was completely.
But it's such a paradigm shift for so many pieces that you talk about, and again, it just sounds like the stories that others have shared already, Madura, Danielle, Katie, of these seemingly impossible tasks. That with folks with such seemingly rigid and trauma-built sort of barriers and blocks to change, and then we bring in this option to opt out when you feel like it and jump back in when you feel like it. But it seems like our systems And our field is so afraid of offering this option out. And it really makes you question, we say we're person-centered, and yet we're still, and it's hard to admit, but we're still pretty controlling. We're still pretty coercive. We kind of want things to work our way. Like, I would never consider, I mean, I have sort of in the last few months, but prior to that, I would never have considered going in and speaking to the child first. And, and doing some of that pairing with the child. It's always pair with the parent, pair with the staff, pair with the caregiver, get buy-in from them to then sort of implement some sort of change. I have a bunch of questions, some around how maybe some of the work you've been doing to, essentially convince some of these stakeholders that, there's another way to look at things. It's something I've been thinking about when I hear all these incredible examples. It seems so simple to sort of, we've got all these wonderful strategies and behavioral concepts and techniques that can be effective and have been effective, although the literature doesn't really speak much to the longevity of them. And anecdotally, it sounds like they do tend to kind of fall apart over time because they're focused on behavior reduction. What is happening that simply offering someone an out, and sort of, and it's almost a silly question to ask, agency in their own support is making such a huge difference, and why have we avoided this for so long?
Great and introspective question, right? Like, dare we look back upon our field and ask those questions? Before I let Oliver kind of speak to that, can I just add, and this related, Tom Gilbert, his work has had a profound effect on me. His book, Human Competence, like every other week I'm digging back into it, thinking, wow, how did I not see this before? How did I not understand it in this light? But he was a Skinner postgrad student, I think a doctoral student. When he came out of Skinner's lab, he was trying to apply operant conditioning to the workplace, but quickly realized that it's not just about behavior, right? And really, everyday parts of life and meaningful fields. And he talked about the great cult of behavior, where behavior is seen as an ends itself rather than a means to an ends. And I think in a lot of ways, that's where our field comes undone, where we see, behaviors change, job done, right? What he argued for was to facilitate and support people to achieve accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior, right? And so I wonder, for Belle, for example, getting her back into school, if she wasn't in a position to feel safe and comfortable and thriving, would that have been a valuable accomplishment? I don't think so. I think it would be a change in behavior. But I think the problem is, again, the orientation towards what we are working towards. What are the desired outcomes? And whose desired outcomes are they? Mute, so I don't make a lot.
Yes, absolutely. Right. I mean, the question is, what is the critical consequence here, right? And is it to sit in a classroom, in the example of Bell, and who's really the primary beneficiary of that? Or is it to be in the classroom and feel safe, right? And to be able to participate in activities, right, from a base of safety, right? And there's, I think there's a real challenge again, and I think that's where it's also really relevant to understand the motivation of others. So this is part of our process. And I think that's what I learned a lot from the PhD elective with Paul Andronis as well is, when they did their assessment, and they looked at, the presenting problem with the individual, they also interviewed other stakeholders because they really wanted to understand, well, what is the contingencies maintaining their behaviors? What are the valued outcomes for them? What is it that they want to get out of it? And what you'll often find is if there is competing desired outcomes, like the entire system works against the person, right? You can have the best plan in the world, you've co-worked with that person, you've designed an intervention, right? But there is still some level of dependence on contingencies arranged by others, right? By people paying attention to you when you do other things, right? By people taking you out so you have more opportunities. And I think that's where it is really critical, right? For those pieces to come together and also understand from the implementing provider's perspective or the parent's perspective, what are your desired outcomes? And they just need to be part of the program. I personally find that with a lot of the literature, right, that we look at, we see people confined to a room where the experimenter has full control over what happens in that room, and that's how contingencies are arranged. Whereas the environments in which we work, we don't know who is going to be on shift the next day with that person, right? The person is going to leave that room and go into a very dynamic environment, right? Where there's so many variables that you potentially need to account for. And I think, those are just important considerations, right? And I think also something that I think it's Goldiamond said it in the 74 paper as well, right? That if participation depends on extrinsic reinforcers, right, then it is really a signal that what we're working towards is really not, what matters most to the person, right? And I think this is, and I think Avab talked about it as well, right? Progress through a program, right? And the person continuing to participate and to approach whatever you're working on is one signal to say what we're doing here aligns with whatever is critical to that person. And if that is no longer the case, well, then it's not a problem with the person, their motivation, or their disability, right? Then it's a signal to us to say, do we need to review the contract? Do those goals still matter to you? And do we need to review the procedures we're implementing? Are they, set up in a way so they align with your strengths and your preferences, and what we're working towards is an achievable step, right? And again, that is a challenge with our behavior support model, because we spend a lot of hours writing a plan. Then we train whoever's supposed to implement the plan in an hour on the entire plan. And then we might see them again a few months later. Right. And already that approach isn't really sensitive enough to, to the person, right, and to the staff implementing those practices.
The second secret word is assent. And so how have you been able to do this work then within such a different kind of regulatory framework that focuses on the reduction of restricted practices and so on? How are you able to fit your round peg into the square hole, as it were?
Great question. We'll tell you when we figure it out, I guess. But the approach pretty much follows what we've been describing already, right? We really have two social contracts when there are restricted practices in place. We want to ensure that we're working towards outcomes that are important for the individual, and that can take a bit longer, right? It takes time, spending time with the person, getting to know them, understanding what's important to them. But because of the tight compliance regulatory requirements around restrictive practices within Australia, at least, like the requirement, if there are restrictive practices, that an interim behaviour support plan that identifies those restrictive practices and includes a plan for a reduction or elimination of those restrictive practices is produced within 1 month of commencing services with that person. So what we see is a lot of those interim plans are really just rubber stamps for the restrictive practice. What can you reasonably do within that time? But what we're working towards from the beginning, when it comes to the social contract with the provider, is setting out clear expectations around how we're going to collaborate together. Right? Meeting with and creating a small kind of leadership team that includes us. It may include other specialists as well, right? As a multidisciplinary team. It may include the participant if they want to be part of that. But that team understands and identifies what we're working towards. And that is typically within this restricted practices realm, it's typically the achievement of workplace health and safety, right? But in less coercive or non-restrictive means, right? So what are the repertoires that we are working to establish, transfer, or reinstate? I really love that grouping, right? Establish, transfer, and reinstate, because it Goldiamond was identifying is that we don't have to invent anything often. We first need to look at, well, what is the individual? Well, what are the team capable of? One of the trade secrets that I've learned over the many years is go in and spend some time with all of the staff, get to know them, let them let their guards down and see who are the ones who figured out the solutions already, right? But perhaps they're not telling everyone because they don't want to stick their head up out of the sand and get it knocked off, right? Like they're doing something that they think, well, maybe I shouldn't be doing this, but actually it's the answer to the problem. Whether it be some way that they engage with the person and allow them greater choice and control, some connection that they've made, they found out that they really like doing this. Sometimes they just want to keep it to themselves because it's almost like a currency, right? Like I've figured it out. I know how to make my shift safe. But I guess the point is that Goldiamond was saying that, look, we need to take a strengths-based approach. It's important not to see the staff's actions as pathological, but adaptive and reasonable responses within the governing contingency. If the governing contingency, so if management in the system says that, you have to maintain duty of care and workplace health and safety, then that absolutely influences and directs staff's actions. So that strength-based approach follows those same 4 questions. Where do you want to go? So the establishment of the desired outcomes. Where are you now? So that's that current state assessment. Well, let's bring the team together and find out, work together from their starting point, not reinventing something or creating something that they're not really there yet. Then let's move. How will we get there? Let's move towards those desired outcomes in very systemic and measured ways. That's the approach that we try to take. It has varying mileage. Some organizations are much more collaborative than others. But we find that it comes down to us using that orientation to take a systems approach to influencing stuff.
Yes, within the funding constraints. And again, right, this is part of the challenge. We really feel strongly that implementing providers, group homes, right, those that feel it is under the current circumstances, it is necessary, right, to use those restrictions to keep the person safe, they need to access their own support, right, that is devoted to them, to help them support the person to be safer, to live a good life through less coercive means. But it shouldn't come at the cost of the dreams and aspirations of the participant, right? So, and that's where our funding constraints currently come in, because you get a package for a plan, and you really, you need to serve both parties. Like, I mean, we strongly feel we should serve the participant, right? Because it's their funding, it's their referral. But then if we don't, we neglect at the provider our kind of obligations, right, under the regulation. So it's a real challenge. But what I wanted to say, and you asked about that earlier on, we really found that actually presenting the behavior pattern as alternative sets to stakeholders, we had so many families and group homes, it just makes click, right? Like it's almost, if you add the other layer, right, to the linear contingency we commonly look at, and you say to people, look, this is the pattern you consistently see, right? But this is what they do as well, right? Sometimes they approach, and these are the costs and the benefits of that. We had so many people say to us, like, wow, right? The behavior has never been explained to me in such a way. And it makes so much more sense. And we actually find it really changes people's kind of understanding and motivation to try something new, because they really actually, they can see, look, this is not a person that whacks me on the head all the time. They're trying all those other things too, but they just don't work for them. Right. And then they can often see how they have a role in the other, right, the alternatives not working for that person. So I personally find it's a great explanatory framework as well, that can be much more accessible than others that we use.
Yeah, because they're really, I guess in a way, they're able to connect with the participant and have this sort of shared struggle. And they're both trying to do everything they can within their means to be successful and live in harmony. And the end result is severe behavior for the participant, and the end result is severe restrictions for the stakeholders. And neither of them want to be in that place.
No,
That's right.
Our across the board experience is that staff value their rapport with the person that they're working with, right? They're in the field because they want to work in the field and bring value and support individuals to be successful. But they're very much caught within those governing system influences, right? Jackson, I think it was, talks about hidden curriculums within workplaces where, management kind of reinforce restrictive practices because they assume that it meets duty of care and improves, workplace health and safety. So there's all of these factors that influence staff behavior. I was just thinking of another example while you were talking, Oliver, of a man that I worked with, and I was recruited because he was engaging in pretty severe aggressive behavior towards staff. And it was often specifically occurring when he was returning home from community access. So it's pretty much as they were pulling up to the house or, walking from the car inside, he would start hitting staff. And this was within the context of he lived in a group home. He had an allocated time in which he could go out into the community or funding specifically for that. If there was a group outing, he wasn't really keen on that because what his co-tenants, where they wanted to go, that wasn't really an interest for him. But the presenting problem was this aggression, this physical aggression that was occurring. And so what we did as a team is we came together and we started to look at the alternative sets. What are his options, available, genuine options for accessing the community under the current circumstances? What was super interesting is that we found out 5 years earlier than current time, he was accessing the community independently. So he had a lot more options to go out freely. It didn't require staff to support him. He didn't have to go out with other people. He would just go off into the community himself. But then at that point, someone, and we can't really figure it out, this is within the government system, so records get archived and it kind of disappear into the mists of time. But someone had made the assessment that he was not safe in going into the community independently. He didn't have the requisite road safety skills to be able to do that safely. So, which kind of boggles our mind a bit. This is guy in his 50s. For 40 years of his life, he'd been accessing the community. Well, 30 years, 20 years at least, he'd been accessing the community independently. What happened? So then the job was looking at, well, what are the skills that may have atrophied that we could establish again? Or what are the skills that were still there that we could reinstate and put in place so that he could access the community? So as a close team, we worked towards that goal, identifying, nearby community venues like a takeaway shop that he could go to himself and eat, but then stepping through the process of ensuring that he had the skills to be able to do that independently. But that required us coming together as a committed stakeholder group. When Goldiamond talks about that second important question, where are you now? He's also asking, what are the assets and resources available to you? Right? In those group home settings, if you can arrange it, the staff team are the most valuable asset available to you. It really then becomes this shared commitment to achieving these outcomes. I think Risley talked about it in 1996. I don't know if you've seen a book chapter that he published called Get a Life.
Yes.
It's another. Yeah, it's incredible, right? Like it kind of lays it out. In 1996, he was saying he called it positive behavior interventions.
Yep.
They are focused on getting a person into a context. So really it was in the framing of deinstitutionalization, right? Into an environment that gives them access to the reinforces and opportunities to build a life that is meaningful to them. And he was pushing against the kind of train and hope institutional model, right? Where you build up someone skilled in an isolated, excluded environment, and then they get to graduate to a real life, right? He was saying, nope, that's not how it works. But the amazing thing that I found when I was reading it, like he lays out a set of steps. And step one to him was build a close-knit group of committed stakeholders with the individual as part of the group moving towards those outcomes.
Yeah, Get a Life and it's interesting, we've another reflection as we tried to sort of streamline our onboarding process. Get a Life used to be required reading for all of our staff, and
Love it.
We kind of pulled it out to focus more on some of the regulatory things, but I think it's time to bring it back.
Little side note, sorry.
Yeah,
Step
please.
aside for a moment. There's a footnote at the end of the chapter. Have you ever read it? Where he talks about efforts in funneling a small portion of every oil drum produced in the state of Alaska, somehow he convinced the governor to funnel some of that funding to community-based programs to move people out of institutions into the community. And I think he talked about their success rates. They had failure rates, but then having access to that funding allowed them to put those programs into place, resource them properly. Just a giant of a man, I think. I think some of the works that he did, meaningful difference. Like, what an incredible figure in our field.
Yeah, and those are some of those, right, systemic solutions we need in addition to what we currently do with behavior support, right? Like, and I think that's also something that becomes increasingly clear, right? It's a piece of the puzzle, right? But so much can be done, right? As John says, right? Like proactively, right? Really designing programs that allow people to determine an occupation that they're interested in if they want to work, right? Or that, where people can come and say, hey, this is how I want my life to improve. Where can I kind of access, like who can teach me the repertoires, who can set me up with those opportunities, right? Not just, again, like being constrained to those risk behaviors, right? To have your basic needs met. So you can see a behavior support practitioner who does who knows what, right? Yeah, I think something else that I wanted to touch on, just listening to John's case example, that's also, worth highlighting. And I think it's been highlighted throughout, right? We find increasingly, and Goldiamond stressed it throughout his writing, that addressing the behavior head on is often not the solution. We often find that we don't need to touch the problem behavior at all, right, as part of the solution. It's establishing those alternatives, and I think that's where our focus should be. And then that behavior just becomes almost irrelevant to that person, right? It's no longer the most efficient way for them, right, to meet that need. So I've got a nice case example as well that I wanted to bring. So this is a man in his 50s. And he had a pretty significant kind of mental health, profile, kind of history of adverse childhood experiences, criminal justice conflict, service breakdowns. And the referral was about him going online onto dating apps and texting people his bank details, personal details, but also inviting strangers to his home who would then assault him, abuse him, take his money, and also assault his stuff. So, and the referral read like most behavior referrals read, right? Like, this person needs behavior support, right, to stop going online or to be safer online, right? And the pathological orientation was pretty clear, right? Clearly, the provider was genuinely concerned, right, for his safety, for the staff safety. But it was like, well, he needs online safety training, right? We need to control his finances, and he shouldn't be able to invite unsafe people to his home. So straight away, you come in as a behavior support practitioner, and the expectation is framed for you, right? It's kind of, we need to authorize those restrictive practices. Here are our incident reports showing all of those occurrences, strangers in the home, assault, all of that kind of stuff. Here are all of those incident reports showing, well, he spent all his money and he gets terribly upset every time he does it, but he keeps on doing it, right? And you straight away, you get this seemingly irrational, right, behavior pattern. He gets upset every time, but he continues to do it, right? So when we did the construction interview with that person, it's almost heartbreaking, right? So what is it that you want to get? And he said, I want to be loved. I want to have a girlfriend, right? So the desired outcome for this person was not safety, saving money, right? Any of that kind of stuff. He was very explicit. It was about social and potentially romantic relationships, right? And then we looked with the provider at what options does he currently have, right, to socialize and to meet potential partners. And it was pretty obvious that there were none. At all of his social life, he wasn't attending any social events, new recreational activities, no employment, and all of his interactions were with the staff, right? And now they kind of further narrowed, right, because they were so concerned about his safety, his options to invite people to his home. And you can see how the service system is like, the pressures on you as a practitioner, right? Can you justify so we can continue to use that practice? But what we did instead, because we had the desired outcome for him was not online safety. The desired outcome for him was very clear, right? More social opportunities. He wanted to have a partner. the entire intervention program was about that, right? Expanding his options to leave the house, to meet people. And then the relevant repertoires he needed was those social skill repertoires, right? Plus, we had to work with the provider to come up with a system for allowing him to invite people to his home again, right? And those were so there was no intervention, right? That focused on online safety, none of that stuff. And you could ask him, and you could almost tell you when he would be spammed, and he did it anyways because it kept the hope, right, for social relations alive. So teaching him those skills was almost irrelevant, right, to him, relevant to the system, and then what was really interesting is soon as he started dating, the pattern disappeared completely, right? The problem was no longer necessary because now he had made, right, real social connection in his life, right? Yeah. And those examples, right? Sometimes it's like, I think I heard you say before, it's almost like magic, right? We don't touch the problem. We do those, creative, nice things for the person, and the problem just disappears, right? But I think that orientation is so powerful, right? Because it really works with the person towards their desired outcomes. And it recognizes that the so-called problem pattern is really competent and it is necessary for the person until those viable alternatives emerge.
Another great example. I'm wondering if you could share an example. One thing, and I've only read through it once, so I probably need a few more goes through the nonlinear contingency analysis text, and I'm looking forward to the next edition because I hear it might be an easier read. But one thing that kind of struck me from that text was that a lot of the examples seem to involve, vocal verbal individuals, often independent individuals that were maybe coming in to see a psychotherapist and sort of, it was kind of that direction. And I know they've got a great book coming out with more case studies. I think that'll probably address some of these things. I'm thinking about some of these individuals that are, kind of have that more, and I hate using these labels, but I don't know what else to use, but, the more kind of profound severity, disability, whatever you want to call it. But, they're living in true, incredibly restricted environments. Often, not toilet trained, quite literally in rooms with no furniture, and just, they call it community living, but it's just a smaller version of the institution that they would have been put in 20 or 30 years ago. I'm wondering if you might be able to share one or two examples of cases like that, and in particular how you, both approaching the staff, but really how you were able to sort of develop a social contract with those folks and determine valued outcomes for them.
Sure, I can jump in first. Yeah. I've had quite a lot of dealings with those situations. When I first started in disability services, I started as a direct support worker working for the Department of Communities in Queensland on the side of the old institutions. So the deinstitutionalisation movement in Queensland was 90s to late 90s. But then, so all the people were moved out, and a lot of them put into many institutions, right? And they'd actually lost things because where they were part of a bigger community where they could choose who they interact with on a day-to-day basis, suddenly they were in this much more isolated select group. Or even horrible stories of victims and their abusers being put into the same house, right? All kinds of horrible stuff. But so some of those individuals had been moved back to the old institution. And again, not trying to say I'm proud of it, but I'm a fairly big bloke. So as I started as a direct support worker, I was put into the behaviour houses, and I had a lot of experience in those very restrictive environments. What I saw a lot of the time was they didn't start out severely restrictive. It was a slippery slope, right? And the school of thought that, well, if there's a safety concern, we can control it, we can manage it, we can put a pin on it. But then the person reacts to that restriction. Safety worsens, right? The risk of harm, the injuries being caused to staff increase, and then greater restrictions are put on place until I worked with a number of cases where individuals were really just living in prisons, but worse than prisons. They'd have this small little living area with a steel cage over a backyard. No direct human contact other than through that cage. It's a horrible, horrible human rights infringement. But one of the cases that I was working with, once I moved out and moved into behaviour support and kind of came back into contact from a different perspective, right, was a woman I'll call her Ada. So she'd been institutionalized for many, many years. And so just to focus on one issue, a critical consequence for her was as simple as getting access to diet soda. She loved it. But the support team and the previous practitioner had decided that because she would sometimes access soda by engaging in severe self-injurious behavior, that they would put that under extinction. And so then what happened following was that was a massive escalation in that self-injurious behavior to the point where she was hitting her head, slamming her head as hard as she could onto concrete floors. And you could imagine the response from staff in that situation, right? They could ignore it up to a certain point where they felt like, okay, if I don't do something now, she's going to severely injure herself. So that would be intermittently reinforced, right? And so like the simple solution was, again, kind of in a kind of more simple form, looking at alternative sets and understanding that, one, there is no evidence that this is affecting her health in a negative way. But more than that, it's a basic human right. Oliver knows my favorite drink is Pepsi Max. We call it black champagne over here. But right, like if I'm afforded that basic human right to drink a box, 30-can box of Pepsi Max in a week, why is she restricted from that? So the intervention was really just getting people to realize how important that was to her and how self-injurious behavior had become the only viable option for her to access that. So it was allowing her and giving her other ways to access that, but removing the infringement on her basic human right. So that shift was the hardest part of the intervention, right?
Yeah.
Convincing people within that setting and trying to draw back to my own choices as an adult, some of the choices that they make. But the barrier was the perceptions amongst the group about how this would be viewed by others, right? And whether they would be enacting their duty of care. So often it's a cultural shift too, right? Where you have to go in and you have to, with humility, you've got to work with people to slightly shift their views from that pathological orientation to a construction. The self-injury dropped away almost immediately.
Yeah. And that's the real risk, right? Because those risk behaviors are so loud, right? And so obvious that we just hyper focus, right, on that stuff. And then once they don't happen, we just don't pay attention anymore, right? And I think this is part of our approach, working with folks who don't have the language repertoires to explicitly let us know where they want to go, what they like. We use the construction logs that Goldiamond developed to track contingencies throughout the day, right? Where people engage in valued activities, where people display indices of happiness, or just situations where we see people, continuously or persistently approach, right, activities, items, situations. And then we look with the team at exactly that. We say, well, how often is access to this available? What are the primary methods of accessing what seems to be, right, a reinforcing experience? Can we increase those opportunities? Can we increase the ways to get there, right? And I think this is the behavior signals, right? There's something of importance. And the question then is, well, can we dial that up? Can we give them access to that thing through other means? I had a case shortly after I arrived in Australia. He was a man with early onset dementia, and his speech was no longer really like coherent. But the reason for referral was he attempted to exit the dementia home, on a regular basis, right? And he no longer had the road safety skills to do so, nor did he appear to have, right, any clear destination, right? So straight away he had a wandering, right, label. He was wandering, right? And so what I attempted to do was they attempted to have scheduled days or scheduled times to take him out with a support worker. But he would assault that person every time they came too close. Like he would get terribly upset. Right. And so what they did is they locked the home. They said, look, he can no longer go out. It's unsafe. And because he was aggressive, they also decided to prescribe psychotropic medications, routine and also on-demand PRN to manage those kind of episodes of agitation. And that would be, you would talk to him and he wouldn't really be able to give much feedback, right? He would talk about, past events, but he couldn't really reliably respond, right, to the questions you were asking him. But one thing we did have was we had this persistent pattern, right, of attempting to exit at home as one data point of value. And what we also do is, we would then speak to family. So in that case, I interviewed his wife about, behavioral patterns, about the person's learning history. And what we found is that person was a really active sportsman, right? So he was a skier, he was a long distance runner. And what he had done in his retirement, he had gone for daily walks, by himself. He had been out and about, right, in the community for hours, just walking around, right? So our assumption was really, that this was a pattern, right, that had maintained, but now under the new circumstances, it was no longer safe, right? And then the question was for the provider, it didn't really look like, it's a neurodegenerative condition, right? So it is difficult to teach kind of, road
For
safety skills. You can teach some basic skills, but some of those more complex skills can be really difficult to teach, right? Some might argue that they won't acquire them anymore at this stage. So, but the question for the provider was that assuming that what he wanted was to walk autonomously, right? What options can you facilitate so the going through the front door, walking on the road is no longer necessary? And the intervention we came up with was we fixed up the back garden. So, and it was very minimal, right? So what I had to do is they had to fix some of the fencing and so had to level the ground, right? So he could walk safely. And then all we had to do was to basically to teach him how to open the back door, right, to the garden independently. And again, the problem repertoire dropped out. Like he just started walking in the back garden, up and down, off the accommodation, right? And then we looked at, well, if you take him for an outing, what are locations, right, where he can walk autonomously, right? And again, the intervention was then simply where the provider had to change their approach to outings. They had to take him to parks, to bushwalks, to places where he could walk safely without people interfering with him, right? And that is a person who had minimal language, but the same principles apply. What does the behavior signal to us that is of value? Can we understand something about the person's past, where the pattern may come from, where the pattern has not been problematic? And then what options can we provide you with, that might achieve similar outcome?
Another great example. I want to bring this to the funding bit again, because we talked about how funding is kind of tied to deficits and you kind of got limited amount of service. I'm wondering how the constructional approach survives in this system and kind of what do we need to change at a systems level to align funding more with the quality of life outcomes?
A lot, I think, in the short answer. I think in our field, our funding body is the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which was introduced around 2013, at least 10 years ago. But a lot of the focus, the outcomes that are pursued within our system appear to be what Goldiamond described as fiduciary, right? So it's not really clear what the desired outcomes, what will be achieved through the services provided, particularly when it comes down to positive behavior support. And then a lot of what's reported and what's evaluated becomes the compliance elements. So in positive behavior support, did the person have an interim positive behavior support plan within 1 month? Did they have a comprehensive positive behavior support plan within 6 months? All of those things around our organizations reporting the use of restrictive practices consistent, but they don't point towards the constructional outcomes that are important to the person and whether those are being achieved. So from a top-down perspective, the starting point is reconfiguring that system to focus to much more bounded and person-centered outcomes as measures of accomplishment within the field. Because we talked about that systemic tension before, right? Like practitioners working within that system, they're inadvertently dragged towards those pathological approaches because the outcomes are so much measured around compliance. Then that's the starting.
Absolutely. And that would also then, right, apply for providers, right? What are service quality indicators for a group home, right? Like, what should people's lives look like? And can we start reporting against that? I mean, as John said, even though we are trying to improve people's quality of life, within the behavior support space, we don't have any nationally agreed on indicators of what that could possibly look like. And so we don't measure them, right? So if you're a consumer of behavior support services or group home services, you cannot go to any place and see what type of outcomes that place reliably delivers, right? So it's exactly what John said. It's this trust me, bro model where you're like, I'm signing my life up to you. Please, please be good, right? And this is, right, the unfortunate situation people find themselves in. And I agree, we can do a lot on the ground. And I'm quite excited because there is a community of practice shaping up right in Australia, where people are really kind of very articulate about human rights, doing better, really targeting quality of life. Our little constructional bubble over here is also really growing, and hopefully, expanding. And so there is a lot happening, I think, and people want to practice differently and they want to make a difference in people's lives, right? But I think the system also needs to facilitate, right, that shift and needs to reinforce that shift, because at the moment, the contingencies, as John says, they're predominantly punitive, right? They are compliance measures and they are punitive measures for being non-compliant, right? So that's where a lot of the effort and energy of the system currently goes.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, we have shared a number of case studies, but so many of the people that we work with, we support through supervision or other communities of practice that we're involved in. Like you hear examples of people doing constructional approaches. They just didn't have the terminology for it. And what we want to avoid almost becoming a cult of Goldiamond, right? But the reason why we use the terminology and give nod to him, one is to stand on the shoulder of giants, but two is that articulates that orientation so well. Like when we start to talk to people and identify and acknowledge what they're doing as constructional, they're like, hey, yeah, I've always believed this is the way to operate, but it's really difficult to put into words why I value this and why the outcomes are so. I mean, one thing to keep in mind is that, we talk about the value of a constructional approach and the doors that it opens up in terms of practice. But on the flip side of that, the trap of the pathological approach is it leads you into diminishing returns, like that slippery slope that I was talking about. As a support worker within the government system, nobody intended for the individuals they were supporting to be living in cages, but that was a direct outcome of the pathological orientation that led them there.
So for practitioners listening, especially those in the PBS space, what's one shift they could make tomorrow towards a more constructional approach?
Well, I think one could really be to ask yourself the question, what systems can we set up in an organization or as a practitioner to really start from a service plan, social or therapeutic contract model? Because it fundamentally changes the trajectory of your service delivery, right? If your starting point is to connect with a person and to really understand what is it that they that they are working towards, that they want to achieve in their life, what are the critical consequences for them? And this is your starting point. I think your intervention will look radically different. And I think Goldiamond wrote about that as well, right? That if you need to set certain conditions of practice. And once those kind of perimeters or contingencies are arranged, practice will evolve and change, right, in that direction. And I think I truly believe there's so much new kind of practice and technology that is still to come, right? From a commitment to this constructional orientation. And I think one thing is really starting with, what are the person's desired outcome, and having an agreement what's being worked towards that really benefits that person before we design any intervention.
Just to add to that, I found that a lot of practitioners that I speak with, they really get a lot of mileage, leverage out of those initial conversations being framed much in the way that Leiden and Rosales Ruiz did in a recent paper around constructional parent coaching, where they framed it as asking 3 questions or 3 levels of questions. What is the desired outcome for you if this intervention were successful? And then, trying to translate that into, well, what would that give you that you don't have now? Right. And then asking, well, and what would that look like on a daily basis if you had achieved those outcomes? And my own experience and the practitioners that I support through this is that it starts to shift that focus from reduction or pathological orientation, because, the starting point is, well, this person, my child, wouldn't be engaging in this behavior so frequently, right? To things like, well, we would have a better relationship and we would be able to spend time together where, we're not arguing with each other, plates aren't flying at my head, right? We're actually enjoying time together. And so then it shifts that framing to a constructional perspective and accomplishment, and then translates that into, well, what are the kind of things that would indicate that? I think there's a lot of power in asking those questions in that way, and trying, respectfully to shift the focus of the people that you're working with to something more constructional and accomplishment based.
And communities of practice, I think it's right. Like, I don't think, I would have committed to this as much as I have if I wouldn't have stumbled upon John and had the opportunities, right, to learn from the Endicott folks, right? Sometimes life is just, like a set of happy circumstances, and then you're just caught, right? And you just pursue what you're passionate about. But I think that's another thing. Endicott folks are super generous, right, with their time, with resources. John and I are also super keen to connect with people, who are interested. And I think that's so important as well, right? Because some of those ideas, or in particular the papers, right, can be really difficult to kind of wrap your head around because it's very dense information, extensive information, right? So finding other people to read together, to reflect on your practice is just, really, really important. And just growing right that movement, I think is really important.
Those cultural contingencies of reinforcement, like if they're absent in the system, in the workplace, right, you've got to build them elsewhere. Absolutely. This is again taken from Goldiamond, and it's about that, how will you get there approach, right? So it may seem like an almost impossible kind of desired outcome to be operating constructionally within this very confined system. But Goldiamond talks about successive approximations, right? You can dream big, but start where you are now and make some slight little shift, whether it's asking that question about desired outcomes, right? Or whether it's looking at trying to understand what the current repertoire is rather than just putting in place an arbitrary replacement behavior. Just some little shift in your practice that gets you a little bit closer, and you start to develop this repertoire of constructional positive behavior support, let's call it that, right? That you can continue to build upon. And as Oliver is saying, if you're in that community of practice that reinforces that behavior, you'll see your repertoires slowly grow and build.
Yeah, I love that. And I think a lot of this, just even in the examples you both gave, are just start with that constructional interview and the early pieces in there. And I love it. Look at where they want to go. And I love the idea of, I think something I'm really taking away from today is the dual social contract. So where does that participant want to go, but also where does that staff want to go? And those directions are probably aligned, and it can really sort of change the trajectory, and the skills that the staff need to learn aren't necessarily ones of restriction and punishment and extinction or differential reinforcement, but instead providing opportunity. And if we kind of met again 5 years from now, what would you want to be different?
That's a big question. Interesting. Well, what would be different, from what we've got now? I mean, I suppose, I would love to see the growth, right, of this orientation just to continue. And it would be exciting to see, how it would evolve. And I would love to see it at scale, right? So I would really love to see, policy and systems, right? That truly support, like people with disabilities, people with mental health challenges, right? To define what they want their lives to look like, right? And to provide them with true opportunities, right? To participate and to pursue their dreams, right? And to have a service system, that really clearly delineates, right? What are systemic requirements, what are provider requirements, and what is it really that person wants, right? So they can be truly like integrated or part of the society, right? And then services, can be tailored accordingly. Like, I think it's just once we intentionally like set those outcomes, I think the design will follow, and it would just be really interesting to see how service systems would evolve in that manner.
Well, I'll just add on to that and say that, agree with all of that. The other area that I would like to see some change in is our publications, right? Going back to that idea of Gilbert criticizing our field, talking about the great cult of behavior being seen as an end in itself rather than a means to an end. We need to focus on valuable accomplishments. I don't see that enough in our flagship journals and publications. Right? More longitudinal case studies looking at how meaningful lifestyle changes are achieved and the outcomes of that, whatever the means to get there, right? I think the constructional orientation gives a great pragmatic framework to move towards that and achieve that. Whatever technology works, we need to be looking at outcomes over a longer term basis. And our journals, our publications need to be structured or restructured in a way that it's possible to publish these kind of outcomes too. Some of our colleagues, some of the people overseas in particular, who are really pushing ahead with really pioneering work around constructional exposure therapy and other types of interventions, are finding it really difficult to get a foot into the door in those publications. And I would ask, how much more do we need to evidence that basic behavioral principles work? We need to show that almost, again, I like Gilbert's framing of behavioral engineering, right? Because it's the application of science to a valuable societal outcome, right? We need to take an engineering approach. How are we using our science to assist individuals to achieve valuable accomplishments within their life? Do you think 5 years is enough of a time frame?
Well, the bar is very low so far, but who knows, right? It might be a heavy bar. Yeah, to lift, yes. But look, also just get construction orientation, right? To be part of like just even mainstream education. Right now, we're really traveling like towards utopia. But just the way we teach children, right, to look at behavior and not to label people to be lazy or criminals or right, but to take a perspective of, well, right, this is a person that's adapting to the environment. What is it that's missing for them, right? What are the supports they need, right? So this stuff is no longer necessary, right? Because pathology or pathological thinking really starts, right, at the point from when kids grow up, right? When they go to schooling, the way society looks at people and labels people. And so you have to do this entire, right, learning history that's probably also shaped, our behavior analysis practice and our positive behavior support practice, right?
All right, Oliver John, thanks so much for coming on Behaviour Speak. This was fantastic. I learned so much today.
Was a pleasure. Yeah. Take care, Ben.
The third secret word is building. This episode is the fourth installment in our ongoing series on constructional approaches in behavior analysis. I encourage you to check out the first 3 episodes. If you are new to this topic, episode 250 is a great place to start. It's called The Constructional Approach, a Primer, with Awab Abdel-Jalil. Episode 252 is called Applications of the Constructional Approach, with Dr. Madhura Deshpande, and episode 257, A Compassionate Approach to Exposure Therapy, with Danielle Cohen. You can find us on Instagram and TikTok, and subscribe to our YouTube page, @Behaviour Speak. And if you enjoyed this episode, Please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.